Hello, NaNoWriMo. I am Grant Faulkner, Executive Director of National Novel Writing Month, and we are here for a special webcast today that's part of our initiative, which is called I Wrote a Novel, Now What? And basically, we want to help you with all of the next stages after writing your rough draft. So that means helping you finish your novel if you need to finish it, revise it, and then if you want to publish it, to consider all the many publishing pathways that are available to you, and to learn, what's right for you, and then to learn how to go about doing that to be successful. And we're very lucky today because our sponsor Wondrium is sponsoring this webcast, and they have connected us with Jane Friedman, who might know more about publishing than anyone alive these days. She's been working in publishing since 1990s, and so she's seen many of the seismic shifts that the industry has experienced over the years. So we look forward to talking with her soon. But before we get to that, I want to introduce or thank Wondrium for sponsoring NaNoWriMo and for sponsoring this webcast. And if you don't know about Wondrium, it's a place for you to unleash your curiosity. And I said it because I don't know how many courses they have, but I know they have thousands. So you can stream unlimited videos and documentaries and series and travelogue courses and more. And Jane, of course, has a publishing course on Wondrium as well, so you can check that out. And I think it's a great way to get ready to write your novel. It's a great way to research your novel, and then it's a great way to obviously find out how to publish your novel. And they offer a bunch of different courses on writing and editing and publishing. Jane obviously teaches one. Joyce Maynard teaches another. James Scott Bell is one of the teachers, and we had him on for our Nano Prep webcast last October, so you can check that out. It's still available on YouTube. I actually learned how to play the guitar with one of their courses, and I researched the Black Plague for one of my novels on Wondrium. So you can learn just about anything. And here's the thing. They are offering a 50% off quarterly plan for the first 3 months. And Catherine is putting that link in the YouTube chat. So check that out. And also, please, just to give you an idea of how we're going to do the webcast today, we're going to do the first 30 minutes, which will be me interviewing and talking with Jane. And then please think of the questions you have, because we're going to try to answer all those, and Catherine will relay those to me. But I want to introduce Jane Friedman, because she, as I mentioned, she probably knows about as much about the business of publishing as anyone. And it's her mission to help writers learn about this very daunting publishing journey that most of us face. And her bio is actually too long to read here, but she's worked in publishing since the mid-90s, and she published this fantastic book called The Business of Being a Writer, which Publishers Weekly said is destined to become a staple reference book for writers and those interested in publishing careers. And she's also the co-founder of The Hot Sheet, which is a super insightful industry newsletter that I turn to and love getting. And it's for authors as well as industry, wonks, I guess. And she runs an award-winning blog for writers at janefriedman.com with a lot of resources. And she's even written a piece about how to find an agent for the NaNoWriMo blog. So check that out as well. So welcome, Jane.
Thank you, Grant. A pleasure to be here.
I didn't know I was actually going to get to you after reading everything, and I left a lot out. So anyway,
I'm sure we'll cover more.
Good. Well, I want to start out just so viewers can get to know you a little bit beyond the bio. Can you tell us a little bit about your career in publishing and just how it's evolved over the years into your current role? The mid-90s, very different world in publishing than what we're experiencing now.
Oh, yes. I started working in publishing while I was still in college. So I was part of an undergraduate literary journal, the student newspaper. I interned for a small military publisher in Indiana, where I got to see the production process of a book getting made, up close and personal on really old Macs. Actually, I think they were the imitation Mac at the time. And I also had an internship at a company called F&W Publications, which, for those who don't know, it's the parent company of Writer's Digest. So that internship turned into a full-time job when I graduated, and I spent 12 years at this company. It's a mid-size, or it was a mid-size publisher. Sadly, it's gone out of business, although its brands are still alive in various corners of the country. Mm-hmm. And, my time at F&W was very unique because it was during this time of incredible change. As Amazon was growing and building power, the launch of the Kindle, ebooks, social media. And one of my mandates when I was at F&W, because I climbed the ladder, I became publisher of the Writer's Digest brand. The mandate was, we need to go from print to digital. We have to kind of change the business model. And fortunately, the Writer's Digest community already had a foothold in some areas. So it actually wasn't that painful of a transition. Moving forward a few years, I took a little detour into being a professor. And in 2014, I went full-time freelance. And so what I do today is mainly educate, inform on the publishing industry for an audience of authors.
Yeah, well, that's very cool. Like I said, I rely on your advice and your newsletter tremendously. And before we start talking about publishing, we got a lot of publishing questions, but I do want to touch on revision. And part of the reason I want to touch on that is you posted this great post on Instagram, I think it was yesterday, quoting Dinty W. Moore's revision metaphor. And just I'll just give my briefest example of that. He said that, I think a lot of people actually do use the analogy of cleaning your house, like your novel is your house. And so he was talking about one room. And if you go in there and kind of fluff up the pillows and dust, you'll make the room a little neater and it looks a little bit better, but it's not really making the room tremendously better. And so he talked about his metaphor for revision was to think about it in a bigger way. And even you might need to take all of the furniture out of the room and then put it back in. So he's talking about big changes. So I was wondering if you could give, with that in mind, what's your revision advice for writers?
Well, I'm going to steal right from Dinty because I think it's among the most important bits of revision advice ever, which is don't start at the beginning. Don't pull out your first page and start tinkering with the first sentence or the first paragraph. Instead, to follow on Dinty's analogy, instead of polishing something, you really need to look at what it is you're polishing and say, do I even need this anymore? Do I want it anymore? Is this actually fulfilling the end goal of this project? Especially after you've just completed a first draft, there's probably a lot of stuff in there that actually doesn't belong, but we tend to get wedded to the words we already have on the page. It probably took a lot of work to get them on the page. And so we're clinging to them. But that you really have to be ruthless. And that's, a well-worn cliche of editing and revising, that you have to kill your darlings, but it's true. That's why it gets repeated so often.
It is true. I know. It's probably one of the most often repeated writing advice, somewhere in there in the top 3, definitely.
Yes.
Another thing, I'm going to guide a lot of our viewers to your Instagram account because you have posted such helpful things there. And I noticed that you published this great chart that covers the spectrum of all the different publishing pathways. And I think this is interesting because when I was coming up as a writer, there were basically maybe 2 or 3 pathways. And now there are a lot more, and it seems like there's even subcategories of pathways within those pathways. So
yes.
I know we could speak for days on this, but if you can provide just a little overview about what people can think about, as they're finishing their novel.
Yeah, the publishing paths chart is something I've been working on for 10 years now. And it's always, the industry is always evolving. Thus, the chart is always evolving. But I would say one thing that hasn't changed is that there tends to be kind of 2 fields that you're looking at. One is the more traditional path where you're not reaching into your own pocket to fund the book. You've got a publisher who is taking on that financial risk on your behalf. And then the other side is where it's self-funded or self-publishing, where you're either getting the assistance of a company or you're hiring people to help you, or maybe you're just like going onto Substack or Wattpad or some sort of social platform and publishing pieces of your work. So I have it, broken down into finer detail in those 2 fields, but that's essentially what the paths have always been, probably for hundreds of years. But technology has, of course, complicated things. And there are also more publishers on the scene that work with different types of deals you may not have seen before. So for instance, now we have hybrid publishers, we have partner publishers, we have publishers that are digital only. There's Amazon Publishing, which is its traditional publishing arm, which is a little bit different than a big five New York traditional publisher. So that's what I'm attempting to do with that chart, is to kind of break down the flavors on each side and how to build the right expectations of each path.
Yeah, that's really important. It is very confusing, and I know that sometimes it's hard to even kind of know, right? Like a hybrid publisher sometimes can seem like a traditional publisher,
right,
in some cases, and not be a traditional publisher.
Right.
Do you have any? I mean, I don't know. Like I said, we could talk for days on this, but how does one choose a path as an author? How would you guide someone? Because I get this question a lot. Like, people are coming out and they're pretty much, this is all a new world to them.
Yes.
And so even like knowing those categories on your chart is, a lot of those aren't known to people.
Right. The honest truth is sometimes you don't have a choice.
Mm-hmm.
So, and what I mean by that is often the dream, if someone is totally new to the writing and publishing community, often the dream is that some publisher is going to pick you up and pay you a lot of money and then take care of everything. And then you'll go on to fame and fortune. But, that's a tiny, tiny percentage of people who go through the traditional publishing path, and a tiny, tiny percentage who actually get meaningful money out of that. And, it's probably like 99.9% of people who are rejected entirely by agents and publishers, regardless of the size. Mm-hmm. So that means you're looking at self-publishing or a hybrid publisher. Now, let's say you could choose whichever path. You were assured you were going to get an offer, but you could also self-publish. Then I think it comes down to a few factors like speed to market, because publishers, they're going to take 1 to 3 years. Some people feel like they don't have that time to spend. Mm-hmm. Control. Publishers largely control things like title, pricing, packaging, position, how high the word count or page count will go, whether it's going to come out in hardcover, paperback, ebook, audio. Like they take all of these rights, and rightfully so, I think, because that's their job, is to exploit those key rights. But some authors, they have other things that they're doing, and they might need to reserve some of those rights. I find that business people in particular, especially those that are on the speaking circuit or have a huge audience, they may prefer to self-publish, keep the control, keep the profits. Sometimes it's a financial decision. Like, you may not have the money to spend on a company or a hybrid publisher. It can be very expensive, like 5 figures easy. Mm-hmm. So some people may not be able to make that investment. And so they try to take a do-it-yourself approach. And you can do it very well on your own, if you do your homework. The thing with self-publishing, though, especially if you're in the fiction realm, is that you can't expect to succeed with your first book right out of the gate. There has to be some level of patience, or like you have to have a number of books on the market typically before you're going to see any traction. So I encourage people who are choosing self-publishing, regardless of the reason, make sure you're committed to it for at least a few books if you want to see results, because it's rare that you would get those results on book one.
Mm-hmm. That's all really good advice. And I'm glad that you pointed out how 99.9% or even more authors aren't becoming best-selling authors. Because I think it's a strange myth that's in the writing world. I see it a lot. Like, people have that expectation, and people have even come up to me and said, "Oh, you must be really wealthy now that you've published a book." And it's quite the opposite, actually.
Right.
I mean, most writers, I think you're lucky if you're actually earning minimum wage based on your publishing. And I don't mean to be discouraging here.
That would actually be good if you got minimum wage.
It probably would be, yeah. So again, I don't want to be discouraging, but I just always want to emphasize that there are different reasons to want to publish a book. It's for me, it's just a gift to be able to write it and finish it and put it into the world and share it and talk with other people. And so I just, I want to dispel those myths a little bit, just so people have the right expectation going in.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Bless you.
Yeah. Well, on that note, you wrote this great book, The Business of Being a Writer. And I think it's interesting because I know writers covering the whole spectrum, including relatively well-published writers, and a lot of those relatively well-published writers don't know much about the business of being a writer, actually. And a lot of writers, because we're so focused on the creative side, which is natural, that's really what we want to do. But why is it important for a writer to know about the business of being a writer, and what was your intention or your purpose when you wrote the book?
Well, I had attended one too many AWP panels where someone said, I wish someone had told me, and then that sentence would be finished with something about the money or the business, the lack of earnings, the amount of debt, the angst that enters into the picture when you have a lot of like MFA school loans and no income from writing, which you paid so much for this degree in. And AWP, for those who don't know, is like one of the biggest writing conferences in the country, mainly people who are paying for a degree in writing and the professors who teach them. So like you said, you talked about those myths. You talked about how a lot of people who are successful, they don't know anything about the business. That applies to a lot of creative writing professors. So I felt like if no one else is willing to write down the truth, I am. And that was one of the compelling or the motivators for writing the book. I just didn't want to hear people say that any longer. Of course, it will still get said, but I hope fewer people say it. Now, what's the reason that people need to be better at business? I think one is to have the right expectations. So you're making better decisions, more informed decisions about whether you want to keep that day job, if there are other skills you want to develop to support your writing career, or to learn what compromises you might have to make in order for your writing to be a full-time living. And then the other thing, even if you don't intend for writing to pay the bills, it really helps to know some business fundamentals so you aren't taken advantage of. I mean, I've met thousands upon thousands of writers who come to me too late, unfortunately, for me to stop that from happening. Like they've paid thousands of dollars to someone who made lots of promises that they didn't deliver on. And this happens on both the traditional side and the self-publishing side. So understanding how the business operates, what a deal tends to look like, which way the money flows, all of that just helps you avoid some of the traps that writers are so prone to falling into.
Yeah, when I mentioned that a lot of, and I include myself in this too, like I try to school myself and know a lot about the business side of being a writer, but I find that every time I publish a book, there's always something new that I learn. And even though I'm attuned to that, I feel like when you publish a book, no one hands over essentially your book, or when you graduate from an MFA program, they also don't hand over your book. There's so much you have to do by yourself as an author, so much like self-teaching you have to do, hopefully through webcasts like this as well.
Yes, it's mainly a self-education process in bits and pieces from various sources. If I had to offer a few specific resources that I think have high integrity and just have an ongoing mission, you can trust them, is the Authors Guild is one. They have great free educational programming, even if you're not a member. There's Writer Beware, which has been a resource for, probably 3 decades now, helping writers be aware of bad actors, predatory firms. Like if you're wondering about an agent or publisher, are they legit? What's their contract like? Even for tech companies, like some of the, companies like Wattpad or Tapas or Radish, Writer Beware has seen those contracts. They've written about those contracts. Look at Writer Beware if you have questions about legitimacy.
Thank you for mentioning that. Victoria Strauss, the head of Writer Beware, she's actually coming on for a webcast like this one. Oh,
wonderful.
In a couple of weeks. Yeah, we're trying to step up all of our publishing education so that people don't fall into those traps, because there are so many of them out there, or there's just different business models, right?
Yes.
And you need to be cognizant or aware of those business models. Well, I thought it'd be fun because your Wondrium course, it has a bunch of different, it's essentially a series of mini courses, really, because you're covering so many different parts of the publishing world. So I thought we could kind of just touch on a few of the segments where I get a lot of questions from NaNoWriMo writers. And if we could kind of just cover them a little bit, then that might also encourage people to go and check out the course. And I wanted to loop back just to this decision. I always think like writers, I mean, it was interesting that you put it this way, that sometimes you have to publish the way that is available to you. You know, like you might want to traditionally publish, but it's hard sometimes to break through and actually do that. So I wonder if we could drill down though a little bit and just talk about that decision though, because you mentioned some things on the self-publishing side that you get like control, but on the traditional side, you get a lot more care that you don't have to pay for, I guess, is one way to put it. Yeah.
Let's hope. Yes.
Yeah, it's true. You don't get a lot of care. Actually, I don't want to overpromise.
I mean, at the very least, they're covering all the costs, right? That's usually one of the big red flags. If you're going traditional and suddenly you're asked to pay for the editing and pay for the design, like, oh, that's not a traditional publisher. So they do take care of a lot.
Yeah.
You know, I think one of the fault lines here in the decision-making is, are you trying to gain acceptance or validation from the very literary community that's out there? And by literary, I am thinking of like the MFA programs. I'm thinking about mainstream outlets like the New York Times, you know, big review outlets, influencers, the morning shows, you know, whoever it is that you might dream of getting coverage from, who might cover your book. And if you want that kind of acceptance or validation, it is so hard to get it if you self-publish. So you have to be really honest with yourself about what you're looking for when you publish. If you're looking for that community acceptance, validation, if you're trying to build status and prestige and the literary community, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but you have to at least acknowledge to yourself that's what you're looking for, and then fight your way through that traditional process, or, you know, to get accepted and then make the most of the experience. I think, in fact, that's what a lot of writers are after. They want to be in certain rooms. They want to be in certain conversations. They want to be in a certain circle of other authors. So traditional publishing, you know, does allow entry into certain spaces. I don't mean to push the idea, you know, it can get very tribalistic between traditional publishing and self-publishing. And I hate setting it up in this dichotomy, but it's hard to get over the fact that in the literary community, there is quite a bit of snobbishness and elitism. Now, that said, I have seen an increasing number of authors over the years who don't have to choose, they do both. So they have things they do with traditional publishers, they have things that they self-publish, and it works out great. I think it actually works out better for everyone when there's some flexibility there. For, you know, there might be, let's say, less commercial projects or more experimental projects that you do on your own, while you take some of the stuff that's more just attuned to the commercial market, you take those to your agent or to your publisher. I think you can look at, like, the big example right now of this is Brandon Sanderson, who is in the science fiction and fantasy community, and he ran the most successful Kickstarter in history. He crowdfunded more than $40 million for 3 books or 4 books that he wrote in secret, which I take to mean in secret from his publisher. Because they weren't contracted, but they ultimately, in fact, will be released by his publisher in a limited way after his fans get them first.
I was going to say, yeah, that's one of those stories that's in the anomaly zone. Yeah. Like everyone can't expect to run a $40 million Kickstarter, and he does have to fulfill all the giveaways that he's promised for that as well. Yeah,
let's be clear. This was like not an overnight success sort of thing. He built up to that over his entire career, and he has the infrastructure to support that. So
it was a brilliant move, though, and it was really interesting to witness that, because there are more people who are doing innovative things like that. And they're not Brandon Sandersons, actually. I mean, I just talked to somebody, Denise Grover Swank, a NaNoWriMo writer, and she said she makes nearly $300,000 a year through her self-published books. And she talked exactly about what you said. She said that she gets looked down upon even in her genre writing communities, but that she actually does make a living with it. So anyway, there are a lot of different ways to go about it. And with that in mind, there are actually a lot of different ways to go about self-publishing too. And there's a big spectrum within self-publishing, and I'm thinking there are some people, and again, this can be fine for you. It might be fine if you want to design your own cover and not hire an editor and put out a book for your friends and family or whatever it is. But then there are also, like on the other side of the spectrum for self-publishing, there are people who they can produce a book that looks every bit as professional as any book put out by traditional publishers. And they have whole different, so I was wondering if you could kind of just cover, like, what would be your advice for first timers entering the self-publishing arena?
Well, first, I want to take the pressure off and say you're probably going to screw something up if it's your very, very first book. They're just things you can't know, even if you research it to the ends of the earth. It's tough to get it absolutely right your first time out if you've never before published a book. So just accept a certain level of screw up. The good news is you can always go back and fix it if you're self-publishing, through Amazon or Ingram or whomever. It's very straightforward to go back and upload a new cover because you realized, it really isn't a good idea to design my own, or I really should have hired a copy editor now that the reviews are coming in saying how many mistakes there are. So, that's the good news. You can come back from those mistakes. I think other than really understanding who it is you're publishing for, I think the best advice I have is to keep going once you've started and not feel deflated or defeated because that first book isn't really moving in the way that you thought it would. I see so many people just give up after the first book because they were expecting to make a bigger splash. And then they start, querying agents. I failed with my self-published book. Do you want it? And of course, no, nobody wants it when you frame it that way. But to go back to one thing I just mentioned, which is knowing who you're publishing for, because you don't have a publisher, it's up to you. The burden's on your shoulders to understand positioning and branding of that book in a way that will appeal to the intended readership. And this is where you don't want to fall into the trap of, my book's so unique, it doesn't fit into any category. No, do not take that approach, because it destroys your ability to market and promote to the people who are most likely to enjoy your work. So there's a lot we could talk about what does it mean to position and how do you figure it out? But it usually all begins with knowing who your comparable authors or titles are. People who liked X will like Y, and you have to figure that out for your own book.
Yeah, that's really good advice. And I have talked to people who they published their book and they just put it out there and did so passively, and then were surprised when no one bought it. It's a crowded market. I just read that. Yes. I think 4 million books are published every year.
Oh, gosh.
Maybe more than that, though. Those are the ones with ISBN numbers. So who knows?
It is a huge number.
Yeah. I'm going to kind of go back and forth between traditional and self-publishing, and I just want to pause to encouraging viewers. Please put your questions in chat. Any question about publishing, we'll try to answer it, or revision, and Catherine will pass those on to me. One thing that I thought was interesting when I first published with a traditional publisher was I didn't truly know what the expectation was of me in working with the editor and then the other parts of different teams that came into play at different points. And I have to say also, I didn't truly know what to expect of my agent as well. But I was wondering if you could talk about what should a writer, how should a writer, like, what's some good guidelines to think about when you've published your book and working with an editor?
The first thing I'd like to say here is, if you don't want to be disappointed, have zero expectations. And I know that sounds terrible. It makes agents and publishers sound like they don't care about you or they're taking no responsibility. And that's not the case. It's just that I think because of all of these myths and expectations of the grand things that will happen, I would say it's the majority of authors who somehow end up disappointed, even crushed when these dreams don't come to fruition. So I like to try and set people's expectations so low that they're surprised when things turn out pretty okay. But to back out of that, most publishers, the support that they offer, aside from the work your editor does, it's usually not all that visible to you. And I think that's what makes it so tough to talk about. Usually your publisher is going to be fabulous at getting the book stocked and distributed and to build awareness among librarians, booksellers, retailers, anywhere books are sold. a certain number of influencers, particular media outlets. So, publishers have mastered how to get a book onto the market at this point, especially in physical ways. I think what they often fail at, and I think everyone knows this is coming, is the marketing and promotion piece, and where there's just a lot of, we'll throw it out there and see if it sticks. And they wait to see if the market signals this, that this book could be a success if only it were supported a little bit more by the publisher. Mm-hmm. So this means the author really needs to be proactive and not wait for the publisher to do something. You want to try and light some of that fire yourself, and also get really clear-eyed about what the publisher is planning. And they might not be upfront with you, or they might not come to you and say what they're doing, which means, again, you have to ask. And your point of contact there is the editor. So the editor is your champion inside the publishing house. Hopefully this person is genuinely enthusiastic about you and your work, wants to see it go somewhere, because it's them that they're going to be knocking on the marketer's door or the publicist's door saying, I want you to support my author's book, or we really need to be doing XYZ. And look at what my author is doing. So they're your advocate. And that's why you want to try and preserve the relationship as much as possible. That's where the agent comes in, because if there needs to be some sort of bad cop, you send them in. If there are disagreements over the title, the cover, some sort of direction, if there's, God forbid, an editorial disagreement and you and your editor can't work it out, usually your agent can step in and try and referee or mediate. So that's what they're there for. Also to spot when things are not going the way they should, where the author might not understand, oh, that's not how it goes. The agent can get things set right again.
Yeah. That's well said. I mean, that captures what my experience was. And actually, for my first traditionally published book, I actually lost that editor as champion because he left the company. I actually went through 3 editors before
oh my goodness.
Before it was published. So it was bad luck, but that happens a lot, Yeah. But I was I didn't know a whole lot about the publishing world at that time, so I didn't really realize the significance of losing that champion. And I think if I were to do it again, I would do exactly what you said, is when you have a question, ask that question. Yes. Try to know as much about what they're doing as you can, because I made certain assumptions about what they would be doing in terms of marketing and publicity that were wrong assumptions,
Yes. And I really dislike publishers for being so, I don't know, tight-fisted with information. I think sometimes I think it's because they don't think authors can handle reality. Like they infantilize the author. And they're part of the problem here, where authors don't know the business because the publishers are either afraid or fearful, or they just want to try to avoid any unpleasant conversation that you are not our A-list title.
It's true. It's absolutely true. And this is like a big peeve of mine, or it's beyond a peeve. It's exactly that, infantilizing the author and acting like the author can only handle the creative side of developing the book. And, because at this point in our publishing history, the author is an equal business partner, and an equal partner in marketing and publicity and everything, really, because the expectation is that you're going to go out there and be selling the book yourself. Whereas you didn't used to really do that so much as an author, Yeah. I'm thinking about the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, but yeah.
Yes. For publishers and agents too, to expect the author to come to the table with marketing and promotion ability, or a platform, or, to be out and about, and then to withhold business information from them is just, it's not good business.
Yeah, I'm totally with you there. Thanks for mentioning that. I'm going to do one more question here since we're on this topic of author platform, and then I'll go to the viewer questions. But it is one of your segments in your Wondrium course, and a lot of people don't know what the words author platform are these days, although writers are getting much more conversant in it, because I notice on my Instagram feed, it seems like every other person is kind of positioning themselves as a writing influencer of a type. And so what advice do you have for, it's hard to build a platform, for one. So what advice do you have for beginning authors to do that?
Well, so I'll offer my definition, since it gets talked about in a lot of different ways. I think having a platform is visibility to your intended readership, or to others who might reach your readership. So that could be the media or influencers or whomever. Sometimes I think platform gets reduced to social media following, which frustrates me because platform is about so much more than a social media number. And it gets very reductive. So everyone, in fact, has a platform, whether they acknowledge it or not. And it starts with the place you live, the place you were born, the places you went to school, the work communities you belong to, the relationships you have. That's where a lot of book marketing and promotion starts. But people get so focused on this larger goal of, oh, I want to be reviewed in the New York Times, or I want to be a bestseller, and they totally forget the closest community or the most important relationships to them, which that gets the ball rolling on your way to bestsellerdom. If you want to build a platform, it's really about investing in relationships that you already have or looking at ways to build on strengths that you already have. So everyone's platform is as unique as a fingerprint. This is why it's so hard to talk about or teach on, because what worked for one author is not necessarily going to work for you. You can certainly gather ideas, look at different models, imitate until you find your own way. There's nothing wrong with that. But ultimately, you have to think about what you yourself can sustain, because this is a career-long endeavor. If your platform building doesn't end, like once you have a book published, that's really, the journey is just beginning at that point. And so and it's very organic, and it's not a straight A to B sort of process. So if you look at it from that perspective and at what you can sustain and what will give you more strength, I think that it becomes more palatable to people, because I know that people are often resistant, like they feel like it's this burden that's been placed on them. But having a strong platform makes you less dependent on anyone else for your success. It makes you less dependent on having a publisher, having an agent, getting certain coverage, because having a platform means you can reach your readers in some form.
Yeah, I'm glad you emphasized that word relationship there, because a strong platform isn't all about the numbers of people who are following you. I always hear, what is it? An agent once told me, it's not the people who, she put it better than this. You want to have people who are very likely to buy your book,
yes,
among your followers. That's very different than just having 10,000 people who might have scant interest in your book.
Correct. Yep.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to go to viewer questions here. The first one is a big one. It's the question I think that all of us want answered. What effects do you think AI will have on writing and publishing?
Yes. Yes. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, and I also feel like I have to discuss it from several different perspectives. So there's AI in terms of text generation, like Chat GPT, which is probably what a lot of writers are thinking about right now. There's also audio AI. So this is which has really been moving at an accelerated pace in audiobooks. So synthetic voices for narrating audio books. And then also imagery, which of course affects social media, marketing, book covers, and any other number of things. So each of these has unique considerations or challenges. I think that AI for audio is perhaps the easiest to talk about, because I don't think that synthetic voices or synthetic narrated audiobooks will have any negative effect on professional narrators. There are too many books. Most of the professional narrators I know are very, very busy. And I don't think that traditional publishers are going to be moving away from professional narration for the large majority of their story-driven titles. I think it's going to be an enormous help for publishers, backlists, for nonfiction, for all of the types of books that really don't have enough market demand to justify the expense of a human narrator. And for self-published authors, it's a huge opportunity, because again, most authors, the advice I've given and others have given over the years is, even though audiobooks are doing great and driving growth, the cost is so excessive for the average individual author that you probably won't see any profits from it for like 3 years. So I think AI audio has now advanced to the point where it's getting almost indistinguishable from a human narrator for certain types of work. And there still is often a human component to it, because the voices have been derived from human narrators who have given permission for their voices to be used in this manner. And there's also someone going in, there's softwares now that help humans work with AI on audiobooks to identify where there have been problems in that synthetic generation. So that's the audio bit. I think where most people are interested is the Chat GPT. And right now, I think one of the best things I've heard about using Chat GPT is go ask it to write something that you're planning to write, see what it generates, and then make sure you don't do that. Because it will be the most boring, rote, predictable, voiceless thing you can imagine. And as a human writer, you're going to be so much better than that. And you're going to be, I think that, but that's as Chat GPT stands today. I have no idea just how sophisticated it's going to get, but as of right now, it's going to spit back at you things that, at least in my opinion, while it reads well, it's not telling me anything I don't already know.
Yeah, I've heard it can write poetry, but bad poetry.
I love generating poems from it just because it's so humorous,
Yeah.
I have seen writers use it as kind of an assistant. Like it really helps you battle the blank page. It can help keep you going when you feel like when inspiration is just not with you. It can help nudge you along. But if you were just to publish what the AI was spitting out, I think you would end up with a very boring book. Again, yeah. as of today.
Probably a boring creative experience too. So
yes.
Just those NaNoWriMo writers out there viewing, trust your own imagination. I think you'll have a much better writing experience. This is a big question that comes up. One viewer asks, is it necessary to have an agent to find a publisher?
No, that's the good news. Now, if you want a big New York publisher like Penguin Random House, HarperCollins, Hachette, Simon & Schuster, you pretty much do need an agent if you want your book considered by one of those big publishers who can pay the biggest advances. But there are probably thousands of small independent publishers of varying qualities who are happy to take a look at your work without an agent. A lot of university presses are happy to consider your work, and not, to my knowledge, none of them require an agent. So I don't have an agent, and of course I'm published by a university press and by my former employer, Writer's Digest.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, that's been my experience too. I've worked with university presses and small presses, which have been wonderful to work with, by the way. I don't want them to get disparaged here or somehow. Sometimes I think what you were saying about the elitism in publishing and how self-publishing can be looked down upon, I think sometimes that exists also. There are different tiers of traditional publishing. Yes. And unfortunately, sometimes those who are published with the big houses look down upon you, like that you're in the minor leagues.
Right.
And I don't think small presses or university presses are in the minor leagues at all. In fact, I think some of the most interesting writing is being published there.
Yeah, they're more likely to take on something that would pose a risk to a larger house. And they should not be looked down on. But what you say is true.
Juan Calvo takes this a step further, asking, can you talk about the need to engage an attorney with entertainment publishing expertise when interacting with an agent publisher?
It's probably not necessary. Some agents even have backgrounds as attorneys. I mean, and you could look for an agent based on that quality if you wanted. Usually agents will have you sign a very simple one-page agreement that essentially says, look, I'm your agent of record for this project, and you can't go off and have a second agent I don't know about representing you for this project or otherwise. And then there's usually some sort of termination clause that spells out what happens or how to part ways if they can't sell your book. Mm-hmm. There is one clause I would pay attention to if it's in the contract, which is they basically can take a percentage of any work that you publish, even if it's self-published. And that's going way too far. I don't think agents should get a piece of all of your action unless you're using them to sell the project. So be on the lookout for that. I don't know that it's actually common. Also, Writer Beware has a model agent author contract that I would take a look at, and that should be enough. I don't know that you would need to enlist a lawyer to look over an agent agreement.
Yeah. Next question goes back to author platform. Given that some people either can't or don't use certain platforms or social media platforms, do you think it's important for authors to use more than one social media platform?
No, I think, in fact, it can be detrimental to be using more than two, just because it dilutes your focus, and it can also impede mastery. So what I mean by that is, I find that authors can spread themselves really, really thin, jack of all trades, master of none when it comes to social media. And so I think that and I'm partly speaking from personal experience here, in that Twitter has always been the platform I excel on. And I think that's because it's text-driven, not image-driven. I'm not particularly adept at the image-driven social media, which I know it sounds scary for someone in my position, because image and video is like, it feels like it is taking over. But, I've been disciplined. I have not, I've tried not to worry or have anxiety about being irrelevant because of my focus on text-driven social media, which right now is Twitter. So I think it's fine to just pick your lane and stay in it if it's working for you. Sustainability, I just want to mention that word again, is so important, because social media rewards consistency and showing up. And if you're not reliably showing up, I don't know that you're going to see much of the payoff that you're looking for.
Yeah, it's interesting how different platforms speak to different people, or they're just better at certain platforms.
Yes.
Sometimes it's mysterious. Sometimes it's like you say, sometimes you just work better with text or work better in that genre, whatever the Twitter genre is.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think the last time we talked was during our Right-Minded podcast, and I'm always, especially in these last 20 years and maybe the last 10 years, I feel like there's just been such overwhelming changes. 10 years ago, I think everyone was like, the ebook is going to put print out of business, and that didn't happen. And now audiobooks are emerging in such a big way, and there's AI, as we touched upon. But you reminded us during Right-Minded that writers have been innovating since the Gutenberg era. So this isn't like a new world necessarily. It's maybe a faster moving world. But can you give any advice about how writers can keep their creative life while also dealing with this big, busy world of just changes all over the place?
Well, try not to see change as threatening or as the enemy, which is probably easier said than done. Storytelling is something that's been with humanity since the beginning. I don't think storytelling is going to go away with technology. I don't think AI is going to be able to replicate the sorts of stories that humans tell, at least from what I've seen so far. I think I give everyone here permission to focus on the creative work and not worry too much about the changes that are happening, because fundamentally your platform and your career grow out of the body of work that you produce. Where I try to counsel writers most of all when I'm thinking about technology and thinking about change is, don't get too wedded to the book as the only way or the best way to put your work out into the world. There are so many options, which can be confusing for sure, but it can also be very gratifying to use some of these other tools to get your work out in the world without waiting or for the permission of a publisher or the validation of a publisher to be able to put your work directly into readers' hands without an intermediary. And to me, it doesn't really matter which tool or technology or platform that you use, as long as it makes sense for you at that moment in time. I've been a longtime fan of email newsletters. I was on that wagon long ago, like in 2009, 2010. And I feel like, trends are now in my favor because now everyone's talking about Substack and email
Mhm.
coming back, or maybe it's on its way out again since I last checked. But in any event, I think you can be successful regardless of the tool that you're using. Again, I just want to emphasize consistency and choosing the platform or the path based on the qualities of that project and what you want to get out of it.
Mhm. I think that's so interesting, and thank you for mentioning Substack, because I think one thing that might appeal or does appeal to a lot of NaNoWriMo writers do write genre fiction, and they do write series.
Mm-hmm.
And this is an interesting era in that there's so many different serialization platforms, including
Yeah.
Substack that you mentioned. A lot of people are
Yes.
using that to serialize their fiction. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about those serialization options. And it's interesting because like just the notion of publishing, what's published, is also very, very different, because you can use these platforms and they're not, they are a type of self-publishing, I guess.
Yeah. So Substack, I think, is a really interesting tool for nonfiction authors in particular. I know there are a handful of fiction writers using it, but I rarely recommend it for people doing novels, for example. But for nonfiction, it's brilliant. If you're interested in serializing fiction, I would take a look at platforms like Wattpad, Kindle Vella. Wattpad also launched something called Yonder, which is kind of like a competitor to Kindle Vella in my mind. There's also Radish, Tapas, Web Novel. I could probably come up with a few more names, but there are a lot of opportunities in the serialization space, and it's a really significant growth area. Now, traditional publishers I don't think they're paying particular attention to it, which is a shame, although they are capitalizing on authors who are very successful in the Wattpad space and then bringing those books out to traditional channels. So I don't recommend serialization as a way to like be known to traditional publishers, but I do think this is an area of opportunity to build direct relationships with readers. And I think young people in particular are interesting to watch here, because I think they're more inclined to read, on a mobile device, maybe than older folks. And you see some younger people learning how to write and publish on these serialization platforms and learn the power of cliffhangers at the end of chapters. And just as someone who watches trends and patterns, I think that's something that's going to stick, and maybe deserve its own column on my publishing paths chart.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's the way I've started to think about it, as its own type of column. And even I noticed I'm not, I don't know a lot about Substack in terms of like its fiction publishing, what's going on there, but I did, like, I think Catherine, who's producing this webcast, she turned me on to Dracula, that was being published in, I think it was weekly installments, but anyway, it was interesting to even get old work like that delivered in my mailbox and read it that way. So I think that's really interesting. Before we move on to some of my other questions, I was wondering, was there anything else in your Wondrium courses, any of the segments that you wanted to highlight or point out to viewers?
I don't think so, but it is kind of a beginning to end overview of the publishing business, from preparing your work for submission, all the way to like getting feedback from critique partners, to marketing and promoting, to self-publishing.
Yeah, and you deal with things like rejection and developing a book proposal, which is important if you're writing nonfiction, and pitching your book, which is also an important and often scary thing to do. So just want to let viewers know there's a lot to check out there. I see my chat notification going off, and the question comes from Arnie White. I took your advice and joined Substack for my novel. Can you give me advice on how to grow on Substack?
What I'm hearing lately is the Substack recommendations feature is driving a lot of signups and interest. So this is Substack's feature where other Substack writers can recommend you. Now, if you're very new to Substack, or you're not reading anyone else's Substack, you might feel like that's of limited use to you. But what I would encourage you to do, as I would encourage any writer, no matter what platform they're using, you need to know who else is in your space. if only to learn from what they're doing and get ideas from what they're doing from a marketing and promotion perspective, but also as an act of literary citizenship, meaning you want to celebrate other writers in the community who have something in common with you, rather than seeing them as competition. See them as a potential collaborator, colleague, someone you might sit next to on a book festival panel, and you're, someone who reads them might want to read you too. So the power of that recommendation system is really working in Substack's favor right now, because everyone's talking about how powerful it is and bringing more people onto Substack as a result. The other thing that I've seen succeed is Twitter threads, which I don't see. This is why I don't often recommend Substack for fiction, because this is where I think these ideas kind of fall apart. But I've seen nonfiction writers in particular kind of put into bullet points, some of their most salacious insights or advice, or interesting statistics, or they'll talk about a topic of the day with their analysis or insight. It could also just be witty or entertaining stuff, but they'll have a thread of, let's say, anywhere from 3, 4, 5 tweets to a dozen. And then at the end, they say, if you enjoyed this, you should check out my Substack. The other thing to look at is Substack has a lot of, at least so I've been told, they have a lot of little communities behind the scenes of different Substack writers who are trying to achieve the same thing. So I would really recommend that you get in one of those cohorts and you take advantage of some of the resources that Substack is offering to build your newsletter, because they want you to succeed. And sometimes I think writers aren't taking advantage of what they're offering.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm glad you brought up literary citizenship, because that's a question I hope we have time for. It's actually the next question on my list, but I just want to validate that actually I have a Substack newsletter, and most of my new subscribers actually do come from the other newsletters that I've recommended. Yeah. And I do think that again, it's building relationships and doing it in an authentic way. Like, I love when I find another useful Substack newsletter that's actually similar to mine, because I always recommend it and try to find a way, So anyway, it's a great way to, and there's actually some benefits to it too. We have another question here from Phil. I have wondered, are there any concerns one should have in sharing work with beta readers?
Probably not, especially if you know who they are. Whenever someone's worried about outsiders reading their work, usually they're worried about theft or infringement of some kind, which I don't want to discount that fear, but I don't think in my entire career I've seen someone lose power over their work unless it was a traditionally published author. So if you're unpublished and you're just trying to get feedback, you know how hard it is to make money off a piece of writing? Like, it is so hard. It's like 100 times harder if you've stolen it. So it's not something I would be concerned about from a theft infringement perspective. The danger, in my mind, with any sort of feedback, whether it's a beta reader or a critique partner, is that you'll get terrible advice, or you'll get feedback that really deflates you or is destructive rather than constructive. So you have to be careful about who you seek feedback from. And if you're at the stage where that feedback is going to be useful, sometimes I think people will be in they'll be in the generative phase of writing, like they're just drafting and they're really just looking for encouragement. They're not looking for critical feedback. And so they'll give it to someone kind of with, stars in their eyes. What do you think? Thinking, oh, they're going to get feedback that says, oh, it's marvelous. I can't wait to read more. And instead what they get back is, you made a typo on page 3, or this didn't make any sense to me. And then you stop. Because what you really wanted at that or needed at that moment was encouragement. So I often see a mismatch between the feedback given or the feedback sought and what the writer needs.
Yeah, I think unfortunately most writers' journey through feedback goes right through that path that you just mentioned. I feel like it's sort of I don't know, it's part of the stage of becoming a writer, and I think we all have our unfortunate war stories where we've been wounded. But I think it is. I mean, one thing that I learned is is exactly that. Like, what are your expectations for feedback? If you just want encouragement, it's good to it's actually really hard to give good feedback. I think that needs
It
to be
is.
acknowledged. And so if you really want encouragement or something on that level, I think it's good to let your reader know that. And also to think about what you want from the feedback. And
Yes.
so I always, when I ask for feedback from people, I usually ask just 2 or 3 relatively pointed questions for them to
Yeah.
address. And that's
Yeah.
just helps guide the process and make it a little bit more constructive.
Yeah. That's fabulous advice.
Thank you. Well, we're at the hour here. I was wondering if we could end. We've talked a little about the future of publishing, I guess, through AI. But what do you think writers should be aware of going forward? So we'll end on what's your vision for the future of publishing?
Well, if you're confused today, I think it's only going to get more confusing, which, but I think the confusion is just the explosion of different opportunities and paths you can take. So given how much change there is, there are always going to be people, companies, publishers trying to take advantage of it for good and for ill. Mm-hmm. So what you need to do whenever you're moving out into the world amidst this change is be cognizant that some people are just there to ride the wave, ride the trend, and they may or may not be offering you something useful. Their advice may be biased because they want this particular sector to take off. I saw this, for example, anyone remember NFTs?
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many companies and offerings and consultants I saw spring up overnight trying to help authors, go into the brave new world of NFTs where there's, the honey and milk land. It's just like, I don't know any reader who's looking to buy an NFT book. Nobody has asked me, how can I buy one? So apply that critical thinking whenever something is changing, whenever there's a new technology. And you can rest assured that at least probably for as long as this video is available, there will be books, there will be people reading books, and it's okay to focus on that and not worry about whatever the new shiny is.
Yeah, that's great advice. So yeah, focus on the joy of storytelling and the meaning that you get from it. And then when the time's right, explore the business of writing, and
Yes.
and take all of the things you've shared to heart. So thank you so much, Jane. This has been really wonderful, really interesting, and I hope people will go out and buy your book and subscribe to your newsletters and keep learning.
Thank you, Grant.
Yeah, thank you so much. We'll see everybody. Keep writing, keep editing, keep going.